far back.
I know. I don't know why I'm like.
You need to scooch
I'll
up.
Scooch up.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Mac Book Club, the best event of the weekend. I know this is what you've all been waiting for. So if this is your first time watching, we are doing the book club every 2 weeks until the end of August. The theme for this summer is lesser-known Victorian books. So everything is from the Victorian era. There are probably books that don't get picked up in school that often. So hopefully new reads for everybody. I am the moderator for the book club, Evelyn. Nice to see you all again. And with me today, my guests are Hannah Stone. Say hi.
Hello.
And Lindsay.
Hi.
Local pillars of the Cape May community joining me today. And today we're talking about a really cool book, which is called Carmilla. It is by, we all have different versions, so you can see all these different covers. It's by Joseph S. Lee Fanu. It's a novella, so we kept it like short and sweet this week for us after the Brontë novel, which was 500 pages and really took up a little too much of my time. So what is really exciting about this book is it's a vampire novella. If you haven't read it, it predates Dracula by 26 years, I believe. So for those of you who thought that Dracula was the OG vampire book, you were sorely mistaken.
Dead wrong.
Dead wrong. Dead wrong. So this was actually the first vampire book ever written in a full-length form. So
this is the first.
it's the first like full-length work of literature, we should say.
Okay.
But it's not the first time vampires came to fiction. So a little vampire history before we get into the plot of this book. The book was published in 1872. The first appearance of a vampire in literature was from 1840s. And this was from, if you've heard that like gothic, like sort of tale at this point of how like Frankenstein was made. Have you guys heard this? No. So it was essentially like this enclave of writers who went on vacation together. So it was like Mary Shelley, Lord Byron. This guy who wrote the vampire one was, I think, Jonathan Polidori. This whole group of friends went out. They were all writers. They were like in their early 20s. And they were like, okay, whoever can come up with the best ghost story wins this bet, which is like alcohol. We'll just give you all the drinks.
Oh my gosh, that's
and
so great.
that from that party is how Frankenstein was written, because
Okay.
Mary Shelley started it there.
Okay.
And also the very first vampire tale was written there by Jonathan Polidori, and it was called The Vampire Tale. And it was a short story that laid out pretty much all of what we know about vampires, like in terms of mythology. So they suck blood, they feast on the living, they rise from their graves, whatever. It was a huge success, and it spawned like operas, short stories, novellas, artwork, comics, all this stuff. Which turned into, before Carmilla, Barney the Vampire, which was like this really hilarious, like, and if you put it all together, now it's like over 800 pages of comics that were sold as penny dreadfuls. Have you guys heard about Penny Dreadful?
Only from you.
Only from me, yeah. So you can buy these like short comics for a penny. That's why they were called that. And they were dreadful little tales. And Barney the Vampire was the first like really long vampire one. And that furthered like the mythos of vampires. So Barney could go out in the daylight, but the longer he went without blood, the more like weakened and horrible he became. And then he had to kill and this was the first like sympathetic vampire, because Barney didn't really want to do this. He was just sort of trying to he was like, damn, like I gotta kill you. And it was like hilarious. It was a comedy of sorts. And at the very end of Barney the Vampire, he launches himself into a volcano to end like the suffering of immortality. So that was like, Barney set the stage.
Wow.
And then Carmilla came some 10 years after Barney.
Okay.
And this was the first time it was like written by a really reputable author. So Le Fanu, he wrote this in the last year of his life. and he had already written over like 13 novels, over 30 published short stories, was a really acclaimed editor of a newspaper. And so he set the stage for Dracula, essentially. Like, the vampires are worthy of literary prominence.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and from here, I think have you guys read Dracula?
No.
These are some vampire newbies.
Yeah,
I need
no,
a
definitely.
Twilight stand in here. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so Dracula takes a lot from Carmilla. So Carmilla sort of, so the things she can do, like transform into an animal, sort of move as this like amorphous mass. Dracula took all of that. And it's been argued that originally Dracula had a preface that was a direct ode to Carmilla. So Van Helsing went to the grave of Carmilla in the preface, and then the
Right, I did
editors
read
cut
that.
it because they were like, you just did this yourself. It's too, don't give credit, essentially. Yeah. But so this is where it all began. Kind of crazy.
Very exciting.
Yeah, this is a Vampire 101 lesson. So let's walk through the plot.
Mm-hmm.
So, Lindsay, tell us about Carmilla. Who's Carmilla?
So, Carmilla arrives to Laura's house, her manor house, and she is this lonely adolescent young woman. And there's all this commotion, and there's this stagecoach approaching, and all this ruckus, and Carmilla arrives with her mysterious mother, and there's some whispering, and Carmilla must come live with them. But this is wonderful news. Like, Laura is so pleased about this because Bertha was supposed to come live with them, but she mysteriously fell ill and died. So,
and it's funny, every 5 minutes, Laura's like, you might think this is weird, but to me, all alone in this castle, I was happy about it. That's how she justifies everything.
I
that's
know,
horrible.
and throughout the whole story, I'm like, how do you not know? How do you not know? Anyways,
but with that, I feel like she wants Carmilla there.
Desperately.
Yeah, even up until the end, where it's just obvious. She's disappointed when she's not there.
Yeah, right. Past all reason, she is thrilled by Carmilla.
Yes.
Yeah. So continue. Carmilla arrives.
Okay, so Carmilla arrives, and then the two young women start talking. They both had these dreams in their childhood where something has pierced their neck, and this chilling sensation overtakes them. And I don't know, they start to realize that they've had some of the same feelings. They swear that they've seen the exact face of one another before. In dreams, they both have these similar feelings. And then from there, it just explodes into these pretty lusty love scenes again, which Laura,
she kind of halfway denies, which kind of makes sense. It's almost like she's trying to be well, I really didn't like it. There was an element that I didn't like. There was part of me the whole time that was just really not into it, but also I was really drawn to her. It's she
was I was repulsed by this feeling, and by feeling I mean I was incredibly turned on. Yeah. So Laura is for better or worse, completely under the thrall of Carmilla. She thinks Carmilla is this beautiful young woman who is very affectionate in a way that Laura refers to a lover. She even questions at one point, is she a man in disguise? The way that she's acting. Is she in love with me? All these things. And so we get to the point where, as we continue, all these red flags, right? So people in the village are dying, and they're dying in all the same way. So it seems which the men in the book kind of write off as female hysteria.
Oh,
They're women are so nervous, and when they get a fright, they just drop dead. Yeah. So that's what's happening throughout the village. They're kind of it's not happening here yet, but it's getting weird. All these people. Then we have the portrait arrive. right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. The dusty portrait that looks just like Carmilla.
Yes. So this like artist arrives. He's restored these portraits that Laura's father, who's unnamed and just called Father, has asked him to restore for the house. And so he brings back this one that before they could never see. He's restored it to brilliant life. It's a perfect image.
Down to the same mold.
Down to the same mold of Carmilla. And what is the portrait's name?
Mircalla.
But Laura's like, that's weird.
So Mircalla is an anagram of Carmilla.
Yes.
Which isn't disclosed until like one of the final chapters, like dun dun dun.
Right, but it's like they can't figure that out themselves.
Yeah.
They're just like, that's strange. Shortly after this happens, we start having Laura starts experiencing the plague that's happening in the village.
Right.
Which is, she's pale, she has these crazy dreams. She dreams that this large animal is coming into her room. You want to get to that? Lindsay's noted it down.
Well, there's the one dream in particular. The what?
The Matska.
Yes.
It's a word which refers to a large cat in Slovenian, Slovakian, Serbian, Romanian, Hungarian, all languages that were spoken in Styria.
Yes.
Which is
in Austria.
Where this is
right?
So it's present day Austria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is interesting because Le Fanu is an Irish writer. He was born in Ireland. He never left Ireland. And he sort of set this tale in Austria, which is pretty common of vampire or monster tales at the time, which we can talk about more later. But so Laura falls into Carmilla's web. We as the reader know, I think, very clearly what's going on. But for some reason, they're like, it can't be her. It can't be Mircalla, Carmilla in our house. Even though they've now discovered that Carmilla, who very vampire-like sleeps very late until the sun has passed its peak, is not in her room during the mornings that she's supposedly sleeping.
Sleepwalking.
She's sleepwalking.
Right, yes. So they're like, you've sleptwalked all through the village where people are dying, and then you've just reappeared back in the room.
Right.
Yeah.
But the door is always locked from the inside, but yet she's out.
Yes, yeah. So this takes up the majority of the book. This is like the book's only 90 pages long. It's a novella. So this is like the first 60, 65 pages.
Mm-hmm.
Is sort of this really building of tension in terms of Carmilla's so eerie, what's going to happen? Laura's falling in love with Carmilla, or is it like a spell? Carmilla's entranced by Laura. So we have this really nice, eerie gothic buildup in the beginning. And then the last 20 pages are just nuts.
It just cuts right to the chaos.
Immediately.
Yeah. But one thing that I was a little bit unclear of, and when we get to this stage of the plot, this is I'm posing somewhat of a question just to clarify, because they end up going, it becomes known that Mircalla is a countess from the Karnstein family, which is a deserted estate that's somewhere nearby, and the village is completely, some 150, 200 years ago, it was just completely abandoned, and the family just gone.
Right.
So we know that Mircalla is a descendant of this Karnstein family, but what is the exact reason that they decide to just randomly go for a picnic at the Karnstein estate is where I was a little bit confused.
Right. I mean, nothing really makes sense. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. But the justification in the book is that Laura and their family are descended from the Karnsteins, just as Mircalla is.
Right.
So that's why they have the picture of Carmilla, Mircalla, on their mother's side, and so they're like, we're gonna go to this estate. It's our old family estate, and we're gonna just see what's up. And this, of course, coincides so that the plot works with the arrival of the general, whose daughter Bertha died in the beginning, and the general is in true end of a mystery fashion. Tells the whole story. It's
right.
This happened to me.
They were at a ball. They encountered, Carmilla.
Millarca.
Yeah.
This is her third favorite fake name, Malarca. Yes, were at the general's ball.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then the same series of events and tragedies befall
Play out.
his daughter. Yeah, they play out, and
The daughter's killed by Malarca. And so the general has become a vampire believer and slayer. And so he's like, well, it's such good luck that you're going to the Karnstein residence, because that's where I'm going too, but I'm going to dig up this grave and kill a vampire. And they're, even like after listening to this whole story, the father and Laura are like, weird.
yeah,
Like, I don't see any similarities. It's not until they're there at the Karnstein estate that Laura finally has this like really brief paragraph of like, oh, maybe this is something.
Yeah,
that's
but
happening
even
to
then,
me.
she goes home after that.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
And is like disappointed that Carmilla's not there.
I know. Yeah.
Just wanted to.
So at the end, we have what like I would say is a very Dracula, but obviously Dracula came from this occurrence, which is like all these people come together to destroy this vampire. There's like a clergyman, a doctor, a general, the father, an axeman in the woods who just conveniently has an
Happens
axe.
to be there.
They're like, oh, thank you.
taking care of this property that nobody's taken care of for 2 years.
Yeah, and he like somehow knows all about vampires as well.
Right.
Yeah,
Knows
so
the whole story.
right. Yeah, so they all come together. Carmilla shows up. She thinks they're just like having a little picnic, whatever. Maybe this is when she finishes off Laura, and instead they chop her head off with an axe.
No, but that she disappears before that.
Yeah, you're right. And then
because they have to, because the grave is actually hidden.
Yes.
Or it was
you're
like
right. You're right.
moved. And that was another part that I had to reread a few times because I was just so confused. According to the woodsman, when you first encounter him, he regales them of the story of the previous vampire hunter in the village who took out another vampire. Was it part of the Karnstein family?
I think so, yeah.
But a male vampire, correct? But then he somehow becomes, we later find out, involved with Carmilla, or I should say Mircalla.
I think so. I think that's
The
her real name
Countess,
is Mircalla.
Prior to her becoming a vampire, and knows when she does become a vampire, like the fate that could befall her. So he decides to like move her grave to save her from basically being murdered.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then reveals the location of the grave because I guess later on he realizes like all the suffering that he must be causing.
Yeah, yes. So they find Carmilla, Mircalla, in her grave. She looks fresh as day, asleep during the daytime in
a pool of
blood in her centuries-old grave. And they stake her in the chest and chop off her head
and burn her.
Yeah.
And Laura, self-care day. And
and we end with Laura thinking like, sometimes I still hear her footsteps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And so ends Carmilla.
Amazing.
Yeah, so there's like a ton to talk about in this book. I think there's so many things to even like start with. I guess just to start off with a little history of like the book itself. It was published, as many books were at this time, serialized in a literary magazine. So it was published in this magazine called Dark Blue. So there's 12, 13 chapters, I think. And so each like week or bi-weekly one would come out.
Okay.
So people would buy this to read the next installment of Carmilla.
Okay.
And it was written in the last year, as I said, of Lithany's life from Ireland. And so a lot of scholars read this as like a fear, essentially using the vampire as a monster to either intentionally or if he was doing this subconsciously, comment on like the fall of the English Empire. This is a time when a lot of people are immigrating into to Great Britain. And sort of using this like Austrian other as a way to explore immigration and fears of like cultures coming in and changing what they have known. Yeah. Are you feeling that?
Yeah.
It's
for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this fear of the unknown, this unknown person arrives at your doorstep and you take them in.
Yes.
And look what happens.
Yes.
You know? So
Yeah.
A very anti-Christian character.
Yes.
On
A
multiple
heathen.
occasions,
Yeah.
you are pointed out that she can't stand him singing. I believe it was like a cross, like a stone cross that caused the carriage to flip in the first place, right?
You're right. I totally forgot. Yes.
Even though it seems like it had to have been totally staged.
Yeah.
But I just like couldn't help but notice like there was a cross.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Yeah.
the horses.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And then too, Carmilla and Lara are having a picnic, and there's a young village girl who's died from these mysterious symptoms, and they're having this like religious funeral service for her.
Mm-hmm.
And Carmilla is like, she can't look at it. She plugs her ears.
Right.
She doesn't want to hear the and it's
so that sort of lays the groundwork for modern vampire myths, which is like a complete aversion to the cross or anything holy.
Right.
And we have to point out too, because this really fascinated me, but like the party from which she arrived with her mother, so called.
Yes.
They pointed out how like ugly and like grotesque the like footsmen were, and I don't know, some woman in a carriage or something like that was like grinning and like do it, get her. Like, just so like creepy vibes.
Suggesting that this like thrall of vampires is traveling together and sort of dropping them off place by place, right? To do this like over and over again. Yeah. So I have this we all have different editions, which is interesting. This is an older one, and it has in the introduction sort of about Le Fanu's life and talking about his work in general. And I underlined this part. He was born into a society that was being fragmented by emergent nationalism and was beginning to collapse. He lived in a culture that had great nostalgia for the past, a very unusual trait for the present-centered Victorians. So he wrote this in the last year of his life when his health began to fail. He suffered from a repetitive dream of a house that threatened to collapse upon him over and over and over again.
That's so fascinating.
Right. And so it's sort of interesting, I mean, metaphorically, what that means. Like, as we talked about earlier, immigration or this empire falling. But also we see that in Carmilla. Like, Lara is so plagued by dreams constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, every night has the same dream. It ends up leeching the life out of her. Mm-hmm. And then after this was published, he died. And I was like, that's spooky. Yeah.
Yeah, and he only died at like, what, 47 or something crazy?
I think you're right, yeah. And he became really like a recluse in his later years after his wife died. He wouldn't see society, he wouldn't go out. He was writing all these ghost stories where... and this is an interesting time to be writing this because at this point in the Victorian era, the Gothic had kind of like faded in favor of more realistic and historical like social dramas. But this is, I mean, a huge Gothic like draw. They're in the castle. Did your version the slosh? Was yours translated or did they call it the slosh?
Yeah, they call it the
definitely
slosh.
not.
For some reason,
Tell me more.
It's supposed to be like a chateau, so to speak, with like a Gothic cathedral.
Yes,
chapel.
and it essentially just means castle, like in German.
It's described as a manor house.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like for some reason the only word that's not translated is slosh. They're always like her slosh was so nice. Yeah,
they really love bringing up that word.
Yeah.
Funny.
I know. And then also really striking for this is like the queerness that's exceptionally prevalent throughout, which Carmen Maria Machado dedicates a lot of time to talking about in the introduction. But this, Carmilla has sort of become, whether it was intentioned to by Le Fanu or not, a like queer cornerstone of literature. So this is one of the first times we see like eroticism between women so much in the forefront of literature. And it's the first time we also see like he sort of fights, like as we were talking about earlier, Lara's like, do I like this? Do I not like this? But even that questioning at the time was really, really like groundbreaking to talk about it at all. And then to also be like, maybe I'm kind of into this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. There's definitely, I mean, but she's never like, make it stop. It's more
Yeah.
of like she's writing about this like discovery and this awareness.
Mhm.
Of
She's
these
trying to make
feelings.
sense of it, kind of like she's trying like, oh well, you're probably just like thinking of like a former lover that I remind you of,
Right.
when it's pretty evident that she's just like,
Yeah.
I want you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like hidden. It's not subtle in any sense, right? It's
No.
like Carmilla like laid kisses over my
Oh, yeah.
face and
She's
my neck,
wrapping her
hot
her-
lips.
yeah.
Like, yeah. And Carmilla says to her constantly, like, "You're mine. You'll always be mine unto death. I want to take you with
Yeah,
me."
she's always talking about death.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's like,
A
don't
lover's
worry, it's
embrace.
gonna be great. Like,
Yeah.
she's just like, you'll come with me to death, and you'll either love me or hate me for it, but to death you will go.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was really interesting, like one of the symptoms of this so-called illness that all these girls are experiencing is like the feeling of like an icy stream hitting their breasts.
Yeah.
Which somewhat she describes as like both somewhat like thrilling and
Yeah.
I don't know,
Alarming.
alarming.
Yeah, it's really interesting how, I mean, a lot of scholarship about Carmilla focuses on how queerness is essentially presented as a disease, because it's like once you begin to be Carmilla's victim, these young women are like in the thrall of Carmilla, so are enjoying her intention, are affectionate. And it's sort of an interesting thing to talk about, contextualize, because it presents a lot of like, I hate the word problematic, but like problematic themes, not only with that carries on to vampire stories for centuries, which is like the ethnic other. We see that in Dracula. Dracula comes from a foreign land, comes into England, aristocracy, and sort of corrupts. And so just like this, Carmilla comes into these houses of reputable families, is not only draining them of life, but is a pagan, as we learn.
Yeah.
She's
They
very
start to
clearly a
lose their
lesbian.
looks. Yeah.
Yeah.
But she does come from the same family.
Yes,
As
so
the
it's
main
actually
character.
also incestual.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like this trifecta of horrible things that Lifanu is like, can't you see that this is a monster? Yeah. So it's really interesting to look at it from that lens too, of like queerness as this plague.
As a plague, and also just like the literal, like the transmission, like
Exactly.
of, there's this
Sexual
Yes.
transmission.
Yes.
Yeah. It's hard to read vampire fiction without like a sexual tint, I think, for sure. Which is why so many of them fall into that category of like gothic romanticism. I mean, even Dracula is like such a Don Juan. He's like, he keeps this thrall of women in his castle. He's like, but Carmilla was in terms of a lot of like vampire lore that carried into Dracula, set the stage for that completely, and yet is like completely unknown for the most part. Like, had you guys heard about Carmilla before you read this?
No, I mean, only because we carried it.
Yeah.
Spooky season. But
Yeah.
no, I wasn't familiar with it until you brought it to my attention.
Yeah, it's so
Yeah.
funny that it's like dropped out completely from common knowledge, really. And so people think of Dracula as this first text that set the stage for like Twilight, but really, we can kick it all the way back.
Oh, you had a Twilight comment.
Oh, I did have a Twilight comment. Oh my gosh, yeah. Okay, for all my Twilight fans out there, remember in the first book of Twilight, and it's on the back cover, where Stephanie Meyer writes like about 3 things I was absolutely sure. First, Edward was a vampire, and then it goes into like this list of 2 other things. And on this one, we have, it was all summed up in 3 disclosures. First, her name was Carmilla. Second, her family was very ancient and noble. Third, her home lay in a direction of the west. I was like, Stephanie Meyer read this book. Which you would hope, right?
Yeah,
If
no,
you're doing
you
it
would hope that she brushed up on her vampire
Yes.
history.
One final thing that I wanted to talk about. Could you talk a little bit about the introduction to this book?
Yeah, so my copy is edited by Carmen Maria Machado, who's a contemporary writer And she also she writes the intro to this, and it's really about kind of like looking a little bit further into this. She also talks about Finu's letters, right? Finu's letters were, he had the letters from Dr.
Hilcilius.
Hilcilius
Yeah.
and Veronica, a woman who was having a lot of these symptoms and discussing them with the doctor via letters, and there are a lot of the same symptoms that Laura is experiencing. So in that way, it also, like, there was likely an actual Veronica that this was kind of inspired by. And also, Carmen Maria Machado talks about the Hungarian countess, who was a serial killer, who was like killing young women in her village and like, sacrificing them and supposedly drinking their blood. And
Trying to seep
but
up that beauty.
she actually did exist.
Yeah.
Wow.
So Carmen Maria Machado like reframes this book as like Lifanu found these letters describing like obviously not a vampire but consensual, much more erotic lesbian relationship, but then he applied a monster tint to essentially. But I have a fun fact for you, which I only found out this morning after reading after reading this book.
Yeah,
like,
this is the big reveal.
Okay, I read this book like 5 times. I love this book. I always thought this introduction was great, but preparing for this, I was like, I'm just gonna look a little more into it so I have some more information. The introduction is fake. She made it up. It's fiction. So you know how she talks about the relationship between Veronica, who's Laura, and the vampire's name is like Marcia.
Yes,
That is an anagram for Carmen Maria.
She got us.
She got us.
Oh my gosh, that makes me just love her even more.
Yes.
So
she gives this like absolutely, I'm gonna drop it in the chat, this interview that I was reading, which I was thinking this is a really weird interview, and then it just devolves into like just nonsense, this interview, and it's essentially like revealed through it that she like was like, why can't I just add my own fiction to this? So everything is made up.
Love it.
That's so funny. Oh my.
So reframing this as like she reframes the whole book as this found letters between lesbian lovers. Because she's like, why not? Like, it's fiction anyway.
Yeah.
That's so funny.
Isn't that what it is?
That's
like, take
fun.
what you want with it. Do what you want with it. Like,
I can't tell you.
Good
Like,
on her.
I know. I haven't known this for years. Like,
That's
literally
so
years.
hilarious.
And so I was trying to look into it this morning, and I was looking into, like, the scholarship she mentions. It doesn't exist.
So that's why it's so funny, because I was, like, wondering about the woman in the 80s who supposedly discovered these
so
letters.
this woman isn't real.
And the only thing I looked up was the comet, and I couldn't find any, like, just brief search, I couldn't find anything about this comet that was apparently both the doctor and Veronica were seeing the same comet, but I guess it didn't exist, so.
I know. Carmen really got us.
Wow.
She got me good. She got me for years. Yeah, she really did.
That's awesome.
I know.
Wow.
Isn't that so funny?
I love it.
I know.
Wow.
So I think in that way, she just was seeking to lend back, like, as we talked about earlier, queerness is this plague in this book, and she wants to reposition it as, like, the author did something wrong by doing that. And, like, I want to reframe this book as being, like, can you read between the lines into this, desire?
I can see that, because I think she does want to, like, shame him a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. She definitely wants to shame him. But she's also like, this story's good.
He's telling this story.
Yeah.
Like, even though it's Laura who's the narrator, it's like his. She doesn't want to let just him. It's their story.
Yeah, exactly.
Get
it's
out
really
of here.
funny. It's like, I always find that so funny when the story becomes bigger than the author, or like people love the story. I mean, same thing with like Harry Potter, right? Everything that's happening with J.K. Rowling. And so it's like, we love these books. Like, can we take that for ourselves, which I feel like is what she did in this.
Oh my gosh, I'm like,
really cool.
Isn't that crazy?
that's so crazy. It's so cool.
I know. That like blew my mind. I was reading this and the interview that I put in the chat is scary. It's like it starts off normal and then the interviewer is a science fiction writer who's like interviewing her, and they start essentially just writing their own story of like what's happening in that moment, and there's like footsteps on the stairs and like something's coming closer, and then it just turns into like unintelligible like
Nuh-uh.
Yeah, but it's funny. It's really only for the dedicated reader because it's a really long interview, and the first half is like totally normal.
Get out. Oh my gosh. That was so
Interesting.
fascinating.
I know, so it's so funny.
We need to follow up this book club with just like a Carmilla like deep dive, because I feel like I mean I just read this book in the last week, so there's so much that I still need to unpack.
Yeah,
I mean, the Hungarian Countess is real because
Yes.
she's like the one. Maybe that's why too, because I was
The one
just doing
thread
this
of
like
truth.
yeah, she puts
I
in
was
a
just,
little
like, quickly
yeah.
just trying to find these things, like not really finding anything,
Right.
so just kind of pushing it to the side.
Right,
like,
right,
oh,
right,
but the Hungarian Countess, the serial
It's
killer,
true.
she was real.
Yeah,
Nice.
I know, it's crazy. And Carmilla has spawned like a ton of cult classics. Like you were telling me about a movie, right?
Oh my gosh. So of course I always need to look into the film adaptations over the years of like and there are a lot
Yeah.
of you know, things
Yeah.
that either steal from Carmilla or just like blatantly try to adapt it into a film. But the one that really caught my attention was by the French director Roger Vadim, which I don't know if either of you have heard of it, but like as soon as I saw that it was him, I was like, that is the one that we need to watch,
Yeah.
because he was very known for like eroticism in his films,
Okay.
like 60s French.
Right.
I mean, they were always ahead of us.
And this is a
Let's
book that's like
let's
begging
admit.
for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so like, and of
Mhm.
course, honestly, one of my favorite films is a Roger Vadim film called And God Created Woman, starring Brigitte Bardot, and it's like this little like French sea town, and she's just this wayward woman. But it really is like super sexy.
Right.
And so you know that he included like all that lesbian good
Totally.
stuff. And when I was reading about it, of course, like the US adaptation like cuts all of it
Yeah,
out.
of course. Yeah.
But the film is called I think the English it translates to And to Die of Pleasure. But the English version they change it to Blood and Roses.
I hate that.
So dumb. Like I said, we're always a few steps behind the French when it comes to
Yeah.
anything
Yes.
juicy.
Absolutely.
But I definitely will be looking into that film. But there are many. That was just the one that really caught my eye.
Yeah. So what did you guys think? Overall opinions of Carmilla? Did we like it?
I mean, I enjoyed it for sure. I
Yeah.
read it like
Yeah.
very quickly
Yeah.
and even poured over it like,
Yeah.
a few sections a few times. There was like a little, it was almost like because the ending, like so much happened at once,
Mm-hmm.
it was a little harder to follow.
Totally.
Like again, like I had to reread sections because I was just unsure of like
I thought that
what
too.
was going on.
I mean, I think the first 2/3 of this book,
Mhm.
or even 3/4, are like amazing, and then when we get to the end of just like solving the mystery, I'm like so bored.
It happened so
Yeah.
fast.
It happens so fast, and it just
So
doesn't give
anticlimactic.
Carmilla her due.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really doesn't.
Yeah.
It's true.
It's like we need a final scene between Laura and Camilla
Yeah.
where she knows the truth, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say I was a little bit dissatisfied in that regard.
Yeah.
And they do give you kind of like when you hear from the Baron, who's apparently the person who's like the vampire hunter that
Right.
just
And this is the character that
randomly
inspired Van
arrives-
Helsing. from
right,
Dracula.
but very randomly arrives on the scene.
yeah.
Like at the very end, it's like, oh Baron, I'm so happy you're here.
Yeah,
what,
the vampire
what a
expert.
coincidence. What perfect timing. Like where
Yeah.
did this guy come from? But yeah, no,
Katie says, I want to read this book now. You should
Yes.
read it. I think in a lot of ways it's more interesting than Dracula. I think Dracula is, 10 times longer, so it's a more fleshed out novel. But Carmilla's just so fascinating for the fact that it's like, at this time, you never see a female villain.
Mhm.
Like, the eroticism is so interesting. It's so gothic, like,
Mhm.
between the two of them in the castle. And
Yeah.
it's so eerie, and the reader knows, but Laura doesn't know.
But yeah, I feel like she just keeps inviting her.
I
a little
know.
bit
Well, you have
closer.
to think about it. It's like we are now 150 years inundated with vampire media, and at the time, this was like the
This
first
was brand new.
one.
Yeah.
Okay,
So even readers, when this came out, are probably like, "What is this?"
Yeah.
You know. And
No,
so
that
that's
makes a
what's
lot of
interesting
sense.
because then you're like, I don't know what this thing is.
Because it almost seems like
yeah.
cliche in a sense when you read about certain
Right,
things.
because now we're so like
we're so used to
yeah,
it.
we're like, oh,
But
she doesn't go in the sun.
Right.
Oh, she hates crosses.
she
Yeah.
gets tired so easily.
Yeah.
But like, you do realize like, okay, if this predates all other vampire stories
Right.
in literature, then yeah, that makes perfect sense. And
Yeah.
you're right to point that out.
Yeah. So there you go. There you have it. That's
Yeah.
Carmilla.
That's Carmilla. I wish it could have been. I wish the stage setting, the stage setting at the end. I wish it mirrored the beginning because it's so good.
I
And there's
know.
all these little
That's
hints,
so
and like in the
true.
opening scene when there's the
So
reflection.
descriptive.
And
Well, you know what I
the
was.
river turns red.
I know under the moonlight.
Carmilla, when she goes into the guest bedroom, there's the tapestry of Cleopatra. Like,
Yes, with the viper, with the
viper.
ass. Yes, with the viper.
the ass better
Yeah,
neck, like
yes.
she's like
Yeah.
inviting
Yes,
death.
yes,
Like,
yes.
that is all so good, and that I love. Like
I know,
I
something
would
I-
totally
Yeah.
want to read the next week if knowing
Yeah,
now that it
yeah.
was written.
Something
Yeah.
I wondered actually was whether or not Dark Blue, the magazine, was like, you have one chapter left, finish it off.
Yeah, let's go.
I kind of think that's what happened. I like looked into it, but I couldn't find yay or nay either way.
Or
But
he
I
was,
like
like,
suspect,
unwell.
So interesting.
or he was sick.
Oh.
Exactly.
Yeah, 'cause, I mean, if he died,
I suspect that he ended it earlier than he intended to, and that's
Yeah.
why it's a novella and not a
Mhm.
novel.
And there's so many things just go completely unexplained. Like
Exactly.
why like characters appear randomly at the end, or they just so happen
Yeah.
to go to the Karnstein
Yeah.
like
Yes,
estate. Like
exactly.
all of those
Mhm.
things. And when I had to like I actually literally typed into Google Carmilla explained because I was like, all right, am I reading this correctly, or is this literally just what
It's,
it
like,
is?
all
And
happening.
every source that I read through summarized like exactly what I already knew with no like ulterior
Yeah.
information.
So that's
to-
my like assumption is he was planning this to be a much longer novel. I mean, at the time they were serializing like Dickens novels, which you know
Okay.
are huge.
Right.
And I think they were like, all right, you got 3 more. Like, let's wrap it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Should we come up with our own alternate endings?
Yeah. Well, now that it's in the
But-
public domain, you can just rewrite your own endings.
So like, isn't that
And then
isn't that
publish
kind of
it again.
Interesting. So like,
That's
Carmen
what she
Maria
did,
tried-
yeah.
That's what she did.
wanted more. She wanted to take more out of it, and she did.
And she
so
did.
it's amazing. So
I
I guess
know.
it's like,
That's why I think this
That's
is the.
pretty
If you're gonna get this book, you need to get the introduction of Carmen Maria.
Also,
Machado.
look at
It's
this
amazing.
cover.
And the
This
cover's
is
the best one.
So cool.
Yeah, it's so cute.
Let's look at
we
that.
love good cover art. here.
Absolutely.
I mean, I kind of like this one too
I like that one
because
too. She
you
looks like a
see
witch.
you see a little bit of booby,
Oh,
a little
yeah.
bit of
Yeah,
titty.
she
It's
does.
gonna be really hard to
She's
see on the
sexy.
screen, but oh no, you got that. You got that.
All right. So if you haven't read Carmilla, you definitely should. If you're a vampire fan, you got to do it.
It's
if you,
short. It'll
yeah,
take
it's
you
90
2 days.
pages. And if you just want to watch the erotic film, you should do that too. Either way, it's a fantastic story. Thank you guys for joining me.
Oh my gosh,
Oh
this
my
is
gosh,
fun.
I'm so happy. Up next, 2 weeks from now, we're reading Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskill. So we're going back in time a bit in terms of publication date, and we're leaving behind like gothic, scary stuff in terms of a more like realistic social drama set in a town. A man comes to town and things change. That's like the vague summary I'll give you, which is like the summary of every book ever. It's like stranger comes to town, things go crazy. Yeah. But so that's Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskill. 2 weeks from now, we'll be back here. All right. So thank you guys so much for joining in. And you should read some vampire books. Yeah. And read that crazy interview I put in the chat, because even that by itself is a hoot. All right. I'll send that to you guys too.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.